Burlington, North Carolina, 1991. A local pastor complained of nausea and was taken to hospital. The diagnosis, arsenic poisoning. Was this respected churchman being slowly killed by his own wife? Was she supportive and God-fearing, or black-hearted and murderous? Because there does exist a notorious, cunning and deadly kind of killer, known collectively as Black Widow women.
A Black Widow is a woman who makes a career, almost, of killing lovers and husbands. These are women who do it over time. They do it with premeditation. Black Widows are an interesting group because they go so undetected in our society. They blend in. Black Widows blend in so easily with other women who are looking for spouses that you really wouldn't be able to tell the difference because they're simply looking for a partner.
When I first met Margaret, she was lovely. We were just so happy that Ron had found someone like Margaret because she was soft-spoken, she was just a lovely person, pleasant to be around, and she seemed to really care for Ron. And she was just a lady, and we were very happy for Ron that he found somebody like her.
At the time that he met Margaret, he was still grieving over the death, the suicide of a previous wife, Peggy, who had shot herself in his house. So Ron was an emotional mess at the time that he met Margaret. He was on a spiritual quest. He was trying to find some meaning and some answers in life. And along came this sweet-talking, pretty, sensitive-seeming Southern belle, and he fell in love.
On the 11th of September 1987, Ron and Margaret got married. It was a small ceremony on Las Vegas Boulevard. They moved into an affluent part of the city and began to enjoy their new life together.
He had set up an antique shop for her in his shopping center there and went to a great deal of trouble to make sure that it was exactly what she wanted. You know, he wanted her to be happy.
For the next 7 years, Ron and Margaret appeared to be living a normal married life. Then on Monday, the 19th of December, 1994, Ron Rudin failed to arrive at his work. Philip Ramos, a homicide detective from the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department, was assigned to the Rudin case.
This guy was the ultimate workaholic. Everybody knew where he was 24 hours a day. That was his MO when he was working. When he didn't show up, all of his employees knew that there was something wrong.
Margaret's recorded statement didn't give detectives any reason to suspect her.
He seemed okay. He wasn't, upset. He had been a little peeved at me over the weekend because I had to work all the time.
So you were the last person to see him?
Yeah.
Ron is one of these guys who came to Las Vegas from the Midwest, from Illinois, and he instantly saw the potential of Las Vegas. This was in the 60s. Ron bought up land, developed it, held the mortgages on it, and he made himself into a millionaire in Las Vegas, riding the real estate wave. By the time he had met Margaret, he was worth $5, $10, $15 million, depending on the value, and he had a lot of dreams for developing that property.
4 days after his disappearance, police officers found Ron Rudin's Cadillac abandoned behind the Crazy Horse 2 Gentlemen's Club. Ron's whereabouts and his movements on the day of his disappearance remained a mystery.
A group of off-duty Air Force personnel were fishing in the middle of the night, and they were walking up this ravine with flashlights. They were shining their lights on the ground and illuminated a human skull. They ran up to the road where their car was and jumped in the car went to the nearest phone and called the police, and by the time the officers got there, because it was such a remote area, it was already daybreak. The sun had already come out. As grotesque as it sounds, it just looked like somebody had a campfire and was barbecuing pieces of meat out there, and that's exactly what had happened. They were there for probably about an hour, and then they found a gold bracelet, a man's bracelet that was encrusted with jewels, diamonds, and it spelled out the name Ron.
The key piece of evidence was the skull. It had been separated from the torso, but showed signs of being exposed to fire along with the rest of the body.
There were a couple of theories why the body didn't have the head intact when the fire started. Ron was a pretty big guy. He was 230, 240 pounds. His body was stuffed into a humpback trunk, a steamer trunk, and one theory is that that was the only way we would have been able to identify the remains as being Ron Rudin. Another theory was that his whole body just wouldn't fit inside this trunk. I mean, it was a big trunk, but still, this was a big man. But either way, I mean, the head being removed was done specifically for a reason.
The remains of the corpse were taken to the Clark County Coroner's Office. Dr. Robert Jordan was the pathologist on call.
Examination of the skull revealed 3 entrance gunshot wounds to the back of the skull on the left side. A 4th entered the front of the head, went in probably somewhere around here, and exited underneath. 3 entrance wounds on the left side of the head, and 3 projectiles within the cranial cavity. The lead fragments appeared to represent .22 caliber bullets.
The bullets were sent to crime scene analysts, but they were judged too badly damaged to be used as evidence. Could this gruesome discovery of burnt remains be all that was left of Ron Rudin?
There was no reaction at all. I had never seen such a non-reaction when we notified somebody that their loved one had been murdered.
They went to arrest her, and she was gone.
30 days after the disappearance of Las Vegas businessman Ron Rudin, the charred remains of a male corpse were found in the desert some distance from the city. The skull was separated from the body, but was intact. Comparing the teeth to Rudin's dental records produced a positive match. His wife, Margaret, was not a suspect.
Unfortunately, there are gender stereotypes when it comes even to killing. When a woman dies in a relationship, a man will be looked at very carefully. That's replete in our society. We don't suspect women of preying upon men. We tend to stereotype men as the ones who are the predators, who are going to go out and hurt women. Black widows understand the difference between right and wrong. But it's like knowing the words to the music, but not feeling the music. They don't have any sense of remorse or guilt or feel badly about it whatsoever. There's no moral compass here.
Margaret was born in a very small town in the South, in Tennessee, but she moved around a lot, 10 or 15 times by her estimation. She seemed to resent the instability in her life, and the family never had a lot of money, and this would play out later in her life as she tried to find stability and tried to find this sort of financial cushion in her marriages. In her 4 marriages, Margaret always filed for divorce, always got a judgment, always tried to get money, and she always ended up at the losing end. Even when she divorced a millionaire, Richard Cravey, she only got a few $1,000s. So she was unable to marry up as much as she tried.
Hello? We called Margaret up and said, Margaret, we need to speak to you. Can we come out? And she said, well, I'm kind of busy right now. Can this wait? And I said, well, no, it can't. It's kind of important. She goes, oh dear, something's happened. We got to the house.
Hello, Mrs. Rudin.
And she let us in. And she goes, well, what's going on? And I said, we found some remains out in the desert yesterday, down by the Colorado River along Lake Mojave. And she said, okay. And I said, and those remains have been identified as Ron. There was no reaction at all. I had never seen such a non-reaction when we notified somebody that their loved one had been murdered. And while I was talking to her, I noticed that she kept rubbing her eye like this. And I thought, well, maybe she had something in her eye. And then as I'm watching her, she's digging her knuckle into her eye, and I'm thinking, this woman's going to poke her eye out. What is she doing? And it occurred to me that she was trying to make herself cry. And she said, this is just too hard for me right now. Please give me a couple hours. Come back later this afternoon or tomorrow, and we can get started on discussing what you guys need to discuss. We got back to the office, and within 10 minutes, if that, we had a call from an attorney representing Margaret, and he said, she doesn't want to talk to you guys. Any questions you have, go through me. And that told us right away, there's a problem here. As we were doing our investigation, we found out that Ron and Margaret had a pretty stormy marriage. And towards the end, they were fighting all the time. We spent probably the better part of a month running down all kinds of leads that just didn't pan out, and then we learned about an incident where she actually shot at him.
She bought from the Spy Factory these little listening devices. She put one in his office, she put one in his accountant's office, and then she listened in from her house on the conversations. Margaret wrote down everything that she heard, and what she heard was that Ron was having an affair. And it got Margaret insane with anger and jealousy. A gun materialized, they struggled over the gun went off, and Ron said, that's it, I gotta get out of this marriage. Ron was a gun nut. He collected everything from little Derringers to Tommy guns. He had like an arsenal in his house. Well, one day, one of these guns turned up missing. It was a Ruger that had a silencer on it. And he had to report this to the government because you have to register a silencer.
He was going to divorce her. I believe he was. I understand that she had his office wired and was listening to his conversations. And from what I understand, he had a conversation with an attorney and was going to see that attorney.
Was the spectre of being divorced and losing Ron's fortune serious enough to induce Margaret to take his life?
Sometimes with black widows, they might live with their husbands for quite a period of time, and then something sets them off. Something was said to them, something offensive, or something triggered a childhood memory. Then the spouse turns up dead.
The Las Vegas Police Department issued a press release asking the public for information regarding Ron Rudin's disappearance. The Rudins' handyman, Augustine Levedo, responded. He said that Margaret had asked him to move furniture in the bedroom and remove the carpet.
And he told us that once he started pulling that carpeting back, there was a really strong foul odor coming from it, and he looked at this brown, almost jelly-like substance, and he said it just reeked. It was a horrible smell. And then he looked at the glamour shot that was still hanging above the bed, and he saw little droplets of what he thought was blood. His words to us were, it gave him the heebie-jeebies, and he just took off.
Margaret had given him a box to send to her mother in Illinois, which he turned over to Detective Ramos.
And that's when we found out about Yehuda Sharon.
Yehuda Sharon is one of the more interesting, colorful figures in this whole case. You know, police said he was a gigolo. He was somebody who would hang around the country club and, you know, buy drinks for the older ladies and provide them with companionship and more. And police suspected that he was an accomplice in this murder.
There were love letters from Yehuda, a picture of Yehuda that she had put in a box and was going to ship it to her mom, and asked her mom in a little handwritten note to take care of these and hide them for her because she didn't want anybody to know about Yehuda. We served the search warrants at the house and the business, and she drove by and saw this slew of police cars in front of her house there, and she kind of just keeps going, and the surveillance team followed her, and they saw her go to a dumpster and took stuff out of the trunk and threw it in the dumpster. We had a pretty good surveillance team, and they blended in very well. She had no idea she was being followed. She was pretty obvious about throwing the stuff away. If she would have known that there was a surveillance team on her, she wouldn't have done that.
Police removed pieces of a love letter to Yehuda and lamp oil they suspected might have been used as an accelerant to set fire to Ron's body. Michael Perkins, a crime scene analyst for Clark County, was on the team that served the search warrant.
The day that we were there doing the search warrant, one of the detectives that was there was walking around this bedroom, or this room that used to be a bedroom, and he made a comment about, I feel like I've been here before. And then as he recalled back, he remembered being there as a patrol officer when one of Ron's previous wives, Peggy, had committed suicide in almost the same spot in the same room. One of the things that we look for when we go to a scene where we believe somebody's been shot is high velocity blood spatter. When we were going through the bedroom, we knew that we were going to have to be looking very close at a lot of the different surfaces in the room, including the roof, and as well as tearing up the carpeting in that bedroom. As we did that, we started finding little areas of visible blood. You had to look very close to find it, but it was all there. If you look straight up, there was a small round cover, and it had a drop of blood on it that was rather large, and it surprised us that with all of the effort that was taken to change the rest of the room, that this very obvious drop of blood wasn't noticed.
Perkins applied a chemical called luminol. When sprayed on bloodstains and blood spatter that are normally undetectable, it produces a fluorescent blue color when viewed in darkness.
When we sprayed it at this scene, we had a very dramatic effect on the wall where Ron Rudin's bed would have been.
There was a great deal of blood spatter evidence on the wall where the headboard would have been, on the ceiling directly above the bed, as well as the carpeting below. So we had a pretty good idea that when Ron was killed, he was laying in bed, and all of those items of evidence, the mattress, the frame, the control for the bed, and the carpeting were discarded in different parts of Las Vegas, and we were able to find them, and all the blood there matched Ron's DNA.
The police team suspected that Ron was killed while asleep in his bed. At some point during the night, Margaret shot him repeatedly in the back of the head. His body was then stuffed into an old cabin trunk, taken into the desert and burned.
Police found records that she had bought an antique trunk, humpback trunk. It was the exact same kind of trunk that was in her store that Ron's body was found in, the remains of that trunk.
We had the indictment in hand. I called her attorney and I said, we have an indictment for your client. Could you surrender her, or do we need to go out and arrest her? And he said, I don't know where she's at and I don't represent her anymore. And that's when we kind of kicked ourselves, because we should have had a surveillance on Margaret. She knew that the indictment was coming. Somebody told her, the indictment will be here today, get ready because you're going to jail, and gone.
She assumed another identity. She wore dark wigs. She portrayed herself as somebody else, and it worked.
She played the part well, and we didn't find her for 2 years.
Margaret Rudin, the wife of murdered Las Vegas businessman Ron Rudin, was on the run.
When I found out that Margaret had disappeared, didn't surprise me in the least. She's a very smart lady. She probably knew that sometime she was going to have to run.
She brought with her, or collected along the way, wigs, books on disguises, books on how to come up with fake IDs. She assumed another identity. She wore dark wigs. She portrayed herself as somebody else, and it worked.
Meanwhile, in Las Vegas, another piece of evidence was found. At the time, it appeared unrelated to the Rudin case, but would later prove crucial.
I think it was 5 to 6 months after the murder, some scuba divers out at Lake Mead found an item that was wrapped up in a white garbage bag, and opened it up to see what it was, and it was a pistol with a silencer on it.
It was a gun that was recovered from Lake Mead, and I examined that gun in the routine business of the laboratory, just test fired it, put those test fires in file in case we ever had a case to compare it to.
Margaret first fled to Arizona, where she was very nearly caught after someone spotted her on an episode of America's Most Wanted TV program.
This is where her manipulation, where her image as this sweet Southern belle, grandmotherly at this point, came into play. This officer came not once but twice and actually talked to Margaret, and she was able to charm him out of it. No, that's not me, that's not me. She just completely snowballed him.
A lot of people called her a chameleon. She would fit whatever the situation she was in. And I'm sure that her life on the lam was exciting for her. You know, she had this glamorous life that wasn't glamorous in Vegas, and now she was the subject of a nationwide manhunt. I think it was a thrill for her. I think she got a rush out of that she was eluding the cops and they weren't going to find her, and she played the part well, and we didn't find her for 2 years.
On the 5th of November 1999, after successfully evading capture for over 2 years, Margaret was arrested in Boston, where she was living with a retired fireman she had met in Mexico.
His name was Joe Lundergan, and he was, in some ways, you know, a sad and sympathetic figure. He had no idea that she was the Black Widow on the run from Las Vegas, and he was shocked to find out what had gone on in her life.
She had wigs, she had hair dye, she must have bought stock in Miss Clairol because she was changing her hair color almost weekly. I mean, I found IDs showing that she was a nurse in New York City. She went through a lot of trouble to conceal her identity, and she did it pretty well for a couple of years.
My first impression when Margaret came in, I couldn't believe it was Margaret, because she looked terrible. She did not look like the Margaret I knew, the glamorous, attractive Margaret. She looked like an old lady. Later on, I found out that her attorney had paid a makeup artist to make her look like that so that she would be more believable as a little old grandma that couldn't possibly do such a thing.
It was a big turning point in the trial when police called Donna, Margaret's sister. She had secretly cooperated with police, and it was devastating to Margaret.
Donna knew all about the listening devices Margaret had planted in Ron's office, and also about Yehuda Sharon.
At the time of the murder, Yehuda just coincidentally rented this van that was just big enough to put an antique trunk in. And police just always felt that he was an accomplice, but they never had that good, strong physical evidence, and Margaret certainly never implicated him.
When her own sister testified against her, Margaret's case quickly fell apart. After a failed attempt to establish a mistrial, and with her lawyer's competence being called into question, it was dealt a final, fatal blow.
During a court proceedings on the Rudin case, during some discussions with the deputy district attorney, I found out that there were bullets that had been recovered from Rudin's skull. This is a .22 caliber bullet. The firearm's .22 caliber. The actual bullet is just the front part of this cartridge, so you can get a sense of the size of it. It's pretty small. Through the microscope, magnified, you can get a sense also of the damage that these bullets had sustained. The lead is all bent around and so forth, and you can see why they might think they had no value. So I referenced back to that case, pulled those test fires, and put them on the comparison microscope and began to compare them. As I did, not only did I see that the marks were similar in character, I started seeing actual matching marks. So it was just a total out of the blue kind of thing. I mean, here's this gun that just randomly came from the lake, and now they appear to be matching these bullets from this fairly high-profile homicide. And when I was done, I was absolutely convinced that the gun that came from Lake Mead was the gun that was used to kill Ron Rudin.
The gun was the piece of evidence that put us over the top. That was critical, and it turns out that it was Ron's own gun that was used to kill him.
On Wednesday, the 2nd of May 2001, the jury reached a verdict: guilty on all counts.
Margaret sat through that trial, and I never saw a single reaction from her. While I was testifying, she just sat there stone-faced and never raised an eyebrow, never shook her head. When we were bringing in evidence that implicated her directly, she just sat there and looked at the people that were testifying against her with just nothing more than a casual look on her face.
The police believed Yehuda was Margaret's accomplice in the murder of Ron Rudin, but didn't have sufficient evidence to prosecute him. Today, he is still free. Margaret Rudin was sentenced to life in prison. She continues to maintain her innocence.
Margaret was more than a Black Widow. She was more manipulative. more interesting. There are more depths to her character. There was more going on in this case than just somebody who mates then kills. I don't think the Black Widow name does her justice.
Margaret Root is not really your typical Black Widow. She killed her husband with the idea that she was going to inherit a lot of money. And had she gotten away with it, there's no question she would have moved on to another person when she ran out of money and killed that person as well. As we think about Black Widows and how they're going to operate, well, historically, the earlier Black Widows used poisons. In fact, arsenic, for example, was very popular. It was just a common way to kill people, a painful way as well. They tend to use poison because it's the quiet way of killing.
Doctors had told me that I had enough arsenic in my system to kill a horse. Blanche was more or less caring for me and feeding me quite a bit of potato soup.
There's often some deep psychological trauma that is inherent in people who kill serially. And I think that women manifest it through poisons and through maybe some of them are Black Widows and they kill these husbands. I think if you look at their backgrounds, you'll find women who have been abused, who have been deeply scarred in their childhood and in their adolescence, and maybe even in their adult life.
I met Blanche on an Easter Sunday morning. She had relatives who were members of the church that I was serving, and she came to the service and we met formally during the breakfast following the Easter sunrise service. And we became friends, and the relationship grew fairly steadily for 7 or 8 months before anything became serious at all.
Reverend Moore was a pastor at a small church outside Burlington, North Carolina. Having separated from his first wife, he was seeking a fresh start. On the surface, the new relationship with Blanche seemed ideal.
Blanche was an extremely religious person, and that made it easier for me to trust her. Her father was a preacher, but he was the sort of preacher that himself got in and out of trouble. And I always felt that she brought a lot of that trauma into her adult life. We were engaged to be married, and in fact, we had gone to get blood tests for the marriage license. And on the way home, we went to the doctor's office, and I was feeling a little bit queasy and told the doctor about it, and he said it's probably a touch of flu. So left the doctor's office, and before we got home, I became extremely nauseous and had to stop and get out of the car. We returned to my home, and Blanche was more or less caring for me and feeding me quite a bit of potato soup. And after about, I guess it was 3 weeks to a month after the initial illness, I got sick again. I was in the hospital for about a week. This time, I have a sister who is an extremely good caregiver. She asked me to come and stay with her. Blanche did not take kindly to the fact that I was having somebody else take care of me, and she got angry. So I stayed with my sister for about a month till I recovered, returned to my home, and about 3 months later, approaching Easter, Blanche and I were married, and 3 or 4 days later, another episode erupted, and this time was far more serious than the others. I was admitted to the hospital in Burlington, North Carolina. I remained there for, I guess, 4 or 5 days, but in the meantime, they couldn't find out what was wrong. They discharged me. I was not happy with what was going on, so quite surprisingly to me, Blanche agreed that I should go to North Carolina Memorial Hospital at Chapel Hill.
Initially, the medical team was baffled by Reverend Moore's symptoms. Then a heavy metal screening test was ordered after a doctor recognized pockmarks on the patient's hands.
4 to 5 days later, they diagnosed the heavy metal poisoning. Doctors had told me that I had enough arsenic in my system, these are their words, enough arsenic in my system to kill a horse, as high a level of arsenic as they had ever seen in a living person.
Our department was contacted by the hospital, told that we had a citizen there that had been diagnosed with having arsenic.
Detective Ayres began to investigate the cause of Reverend Moore's illness.
The first thing they did was to check all of the chemicals and pesticides that I had at home. I had been using a herbicide on my lawn to kill the weeds, and I had a number of herbicides and pesticides, and they brought all of those in to check them out.
All the pesticides from Reverend Moore's house were analyzed, but it was found that none of them could have caused his illness. Were heavy metals in the environment making Reverend Moore sick, or was someone deliberately poisoning him?
Women who do that, black widows, can be the most engaging, convincing people. They are so sincere because they live in denial of what they do, that they actually convince most people around them that they really are innocent. And so, you know, if you have an engaging person whose husband comes to the hospital and he's ill, and she's so concerned about his health and welfare, why would you suspect there's any foul play? It was real hot that afternoon that we met Blanche at the house. We'd all decided, you know, if we want anything to drink, we need to take it with us. And so when we got to the house, she said, "Y'all like something to drink?" And we said, no thank you. We brought her on, and she said, "I don't guess you'd want to drink anything that I would fix." And we all thought that was very suspicious, that she would make a statement like that to us when we haven't led her to believe she was under suspicion.
When the poisoning was diagnosed, they became extremely strict on who I could see and who I could not see. I had 24-hour sitter, and no one was permitted to come into the room unless the sitter was there. And Blanche did not take too kindly to that.
During that time, the SBI was called in. While they were interviewing Reverend Moore, they asked him about his bride, Blanche, and was there anyone close to her that died mysteriously or had anything unusual happening?
And I said, yes, Raymond Reed, who died of Guillain-Barré syndrome.
Guillain-Barré syndrome is a neurological condition that's actually sort of an allergic, an autoimmune type of response, usually to an infection or sometimes to a vaccination or the like. But it's a neuropathy, so it's an affliction of the nerves. While a disturbing condition, most people recover from it. So in the case of Mr. Reed, upon reviewing those records, I felt that his symptomatology was perfectly consistent with arsenic poisoning.
At Dr. Butt's request, the body of Raymond Reed was exhumed.
When we ran toxicological studies, we also found potentially lethal quantities of arsenic in his system.
And about maybe a week or two after it was announced we were going to go to trial, this letter appears, and we see Mitch McIntyre on the news holding this letter saying, "Here's the solution to the whole case. Another man has confessed to it."
While investigating the arsenic poisoning of Reverend Dwight Moore, detectives had begun to suspect his wife, Blanche. They looked into her past and discovered that her former boyfriend, Raymond Reed, had reportedly died of a rare disease. But when his body was exhumed and examined, it was found to contain large amounts of arsenic.
I did not know Raymond Reed any more than what she had told me about him. All the time that he was in the hospital, eventually dying. She cared for him, took care of him intensely, visited him every day. She had had especially a difficult childhood. I suppose I chalked it up to just the traumas that she had experienced as a child.
Black widows have developed a capacity for harming other people, and they are void of an emotional response to that. They don't feel a sense of guilt or don't feel badness about it. It's what they do. It's their business. It's a way that they survive in their lives. And it is a different mindset. It can be a very chilling one when you think of someone who is actually in their bed, lying there in bed suffering and being fed more poison.
They began to look at circumstances of other people in her life, and they checked out and exhumed the body of her first husband, James Taylor. And when he was dug up, he was also found to have a high level of arsenic. He'd been diagnosed as dying from a heart attack. And they dug up other bodies and found high levels of arsenic in her father, P.D. Kaiser, and her mother-in-law, Isla Taylor, who died the year after her first husband.
The investigators decided to test a sample of Reverend Moore's hair to determine how long he had been ingesting poison.
And Blanche decided all of a sudden that I needed a haircut. And she was very insistent that I get a haircut. But the investigator got to me the night before he came in to cut my hair.
Well, the hair was very important because the hair samples were cut into numerous little strips, and you could see the arsenic going up and down over a period of 6 to 9 months. There were really strong correlations. For example, when Raymond Reed was in the hospital and he got a major administration of arsenic, it was right after Blanche heard that he was going to be released. In the next week, it gets a huge amount of arsenic.
It was suspected that anti-ant, a common household pesticide containing arsenic, was used to poison Raymond Reed and Reverend Moore.
We went back and talked to Dwight, and Dwight still felt like he had Guillain-Barré. And so we really just had to have a frank, straight out conversation with him and just laid out exactly what we had found, that he had arsenic. He did not have Guillain-Barré, and that Raymond Reed died from not Guillain-Barré, but arsenic poisoning. And there's one common bond between the two of you folks, and that's Blanche. And, we're looking into that.
I became aware that it was Blanche. And it hit me so clearly.
There was enough evidence to charge Blanche with the attempted murder of Reverend Moore, but the detectives still hoped that she might confess to poisoning him.
We had discussed it, decided not to arrest her at the time because she was still talking to us and communicating with us. We felt like that there were still opportunities to get information from her. We'd also talked to her lawyer and told him if we decided to arrest her that we would just call him. He would bring her up.
Well, after Raymond Reed's body was examined and a high level of arsenic was found in his body, we were contacted by the Alamance County Sheriff Department and told us that we might be interested in the death of her first husband, James Taylor. His death certificate lists him as dying of heart attack.
While Blanche was the chief suspect in the suspicious deaths of her father, first husband, and mother-in-law, prosecutors decided to charge Blanche only with the murder of Raymond Reed. They took her into custody.
And about maybe a week or two after it was announced we were going to go to trial, this letter appears, and we see Mitch McIntyre on the news holding this letter saying, here's the solution to the whole case. Another man has confessed to it, and he took the police with him to interview the man's mother and aunt and try to make a case that Garvin Thomas actually poisoned these people based on the letter.
Garvin Thomas, a friend of Blanche who had recently passed away, was said to be the author of the letter. It included not only a confession, but also revealed a sexual fascination with Blanche. The prosecutors suspected that Blanche wrote the letter herself, but would they be able to convince a jury?
I sent the investigators out to Reverend Moore's church. They located a woman named Doris Pender who had received 40 letters from Blanche Moore while she was in custody. That gave us about 200 known handwriting samples of Blanche's own handwriting that we could compare to this 5-page letter. The SBI told me it was the largest known handwriting sample or exemplars that they'd ever had to compare to a question document, and they had no hesitation in concluding that she was the author of the Garvin-Thomas letter.
Reverend Moore entered the witness box.
I had told the prosecutor I have a severe problem with tremors, and as soon as I got on the witness stand, she handed me a glass of water, and I strugglingly held the glass as it splashed a little bit, and she broke down crying, and the defense immediately objected. And the judge obviously didn't buy that argument. He said he'd seen defense attorneys and prosecutors cry many times.
Blanche pleaded not guilty to all the charges.
I was not surprised when she proclaimed her innocence or denied any involvement in what had happened to me or to Raymond Reed.
With both sides in the case having been heard, Blanche's fate was in the hands of the jury.
It was just so horrendous, the suffering of Raymond Reed and Dwight Moore, especially Raymond Reed. His body swelled up and split open. He described pain like the pressure of an elephant standing on his chest. He had projectile vomiting, just so many horrible things that he had to go through. I reviewed with the jury all of his sufferings for 130 days while she stood by. They heard about the terrible things that Dwight Moore went through, and they could see him shaking and trembling in the courtroom. They just felt like, in a trial that lasted 3 weeks, for her to get up there and contradict things that they heard people show and describe in court, they just felt like, that was terrible. And she seemed to say she was a Christian lady who could do no wrong, and this other man did it. She offered no remorse. She never said she was sorry or apologized for anything that she did. She offered no explanation for any of her behavior, and I believe the jury just felt like they didn't really have much choice.
The jury found Blanche guilty and recommended the death penalty.
I guess one does try to do a lot of soul searching about how they can get themselves into this kind of situation and not see what's going on. But I have no answer to that. I don't think there is any possible way that I could have predicted that she was going to try to take my life. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. I obviously felt extremely grateful, and that somehow God must have something left for me to do.
Blanche Taylor Moore is a very typical black widow. We think of black widows as women who poison their victims, and so she really kind of fits that mold. These are women who are very methodical. They have no sense of guilt or remorse or contrition or empathy or sympathy. They don't have those kinds of emotions. It is all about taking care of business.
Several appeals have been denied, and Blanche Taylor Moore is currently on death row in North Carolina, awaiting execution.